I got pregnant for the first time about a little less than 2 years ago at the age of 36. And for my friend group, that's just slightly above average. But when I went to my first OB appointment, I learned that because I was over the age of 35, I was considered to be of advanced maternal age. And my pregnancy was actually called a geriatric pregnancy. That's the actual term that they use. And so that didn't make me feel so great. And then as I went to subsequent doctor appointments with my husband, Jeff, I felt even worse because all they do at those initial doctor appointments is warn you about everything that can go wrong. So they're constantly telling you about the risks of miscarriage and chromosomal abnormalities and the very high probability that your kid will come out looking like Sloth from the Goonies. And throughout all of this, I made a rule for myself to avoid all medical Googling so that I wouldn't spend a lot of time worrying about things that were likely not to happen. So I didn't. I stayed away from Googling, and I didn't obsess. I didn't stress out. And on July 8th, 2014, I gave birth to a very healthy baby boy. And we were thrilled. He was amazing. We named him James, and he had brown hair and blue eyes and this way of looking at everything like it was the best thing he had ever seen, and probably because he was only a day old. But we were just so in love with him. And we brought him home, and then the reality of having a newborn kicked in. So I was trying to breastfeed him, and if you don't know, newborns have to eat about every 2 hours. And if you're breastfeeding, you physically have to be present for all of those feedings, which just is a really grueling system. And so I was having a hard time keeping up with that. And then when he wasn't eating, he would sleep, but he would only sleep if one of us was holding him. And we couldn't sleep if we were holding him because you might drop him, and that would be bad for a variety of reasons. So that it just felt very unsustainable for us to have to hold him for him to sleep. And so the way we coped with it was kind of setting up our life into shifts. So we would take turns. One of us would try to catch a little bit of sleep, and the other would feed, burp, change, swaddle, rock, rinse, repeat over and over again, and it was the same routine. And every 2 hours we would sort of trade off and just kind of pass in the night like bleary-eyed factory workers, and it's just hellish. It's no way to live. If you haven't had kids, don't do it. And the whole time this was going on, all of our friends and family are visiting us, and they want to meet James, and they all say the same thing. They say, "Oh, it gets better." Our friends said it, our parents, the pediatrician, the guy at the deli, it gets better. And at one point, my husband just said, "If anybody says it gets better again, I'm just going to scream. When does it get better?" And I said, "Well, my mom said she thinks it starts to get better around 3 months. And he just said, "That is way too long." And I agreed, because to you, 3 months might not sound like a long period of time, but when you're struggling to get through the day in these 2 hour sleep-deprived chunks, it feels like an eternity. So this was kind of my mindset one night when I was feeding my son, and I had just finished feeding him, and I noticed that my left breast hurt. And I had this area on my breast that was red and swollen and a little hard to the touch and very sore. And I thought maybe it was a blocked duct. So a blocked duct is something that can happen when you're breastfeeding, where the milk doesn't come out entirely, and there's an area of your breast that can swell up, and it's painful. And I talked to my cousin. She has a couple of kids, and she said, "Yeah, that sounds like a blocked duct. Try putting a warm compress on it, and it should get better." And so I tried that for about a week, and it didn't get better. And so I went to my OBGYN, and she said, "Well, maybe it's mastitis, and that's a breast infection that you can get when you're breastfeeding. And usually it's accompanied by these really terrible flu-like symptoms where you get a fever and chills." And I didn't have any flu-like symptoms, but the OB said, "Well, I'll prescribe an antibiotic, and we'll see if it gets better." So she prescribed an antibiotic, and it didn't get better. And then she tried me on another antibiotic, and it still didn't get better. And as a matter of fact, it was getting worse. It was getting more red, more swollen, more painful. And it was really starting to bother me now. And so she sent me to get some imaging done. And I took a taxi from our home in Brooklyn to the imaging center in Chelsea. And it was this beautiful sunny day in August. And it was the first time I had been out of the house in a long time. And I felt like I was just sort of watching real life pass me by while I was in the car. This life that I used to have. And so I was driving over the Manhattan Bridge, up through the Lower East Side, through the East Village where Jeff and I lived before we had the baby. And we're passing all these places where we used to go. So we go by the Bowery Ballroom where, and I'm remembering this great New Year's Eve we spent there watching Patti Smith play. And then we pass B-Bar, where we used to get brunch sometimes on Saturdays at 2 p.m. after sleeping until 1. And then we pass the St. Mark's bookshop, and we used to sometimes go there and just browse for hours, the sort of well-curated selections of books recommended by the clerks there. And then we would go home and guiltily buy the books on our Kindles and read late into the night. And these very simple pleasures of, seeing a concert, going to brunch, sleeping in, reading a book, they just felt so completely out of reach in my current life situation, and I just missed them so much. So I get to the imaging center, and I go in for my ultrasound, and the tech is moving the wand sort of in circles around the problem area on my breast. And I'm just studying her face for any sort of reaction. I'm just looking to see if she's alarmed by anything she's seeing. And she's kind of this stoic Eastern European woman, and she's giving me nothing. And she finishes the ultrasound. I go back to the waiting room, and then they call me in for a mammogram. Now, I had never had a mammogram before because I was young, or at least I thought I was young until all of this started to happen. And usually you don't get a mammogram until you're 40. So if you don't know, in a mammogram, they take your breast and they squeeze it between two pieces of glass until it's about the thickness of a pancake, which is painful under the best of circumstances. But when you already have a very sore, engorged breast from breastfeeding and a potential infection, it's horrendously painful. So I endure the mammogram, and I go back to the waiting room again, page through another Us Weekly. And then it's my time to see the doctor. So I walk out of the waiting room, down the hallway to the doctor's office, and it's just this little room, not much bigger than a closet. And she has my ultrasound and my mammogram images on her computer. And she's a middle-aged woman, well into advanced maternal age herself, and she's got about shoulder-length graying hair, and she looks a little like Jane Pauley, the newscaster. And she says to me, well, your OB sent you here to see if you had an abscess, which is an infection in your breast that can be drained. And I don't see an abscess here. You do, however, have a large mass in your left breast. And my recommendation is that you go see a breast surgeon as soon as possible and get a biopsy done to rule things out. It doesn't really register to me what she's talking about, and so I just sort of say, okay, and she hands me some paperwork and sends me on my way. And I walk down the hallway and then back into the waiting room. And this time, as I'm going through the waiting room, I kind of notice the other women in the waiting room for the first time. And I look up and I see some of the women are kind of pale and have dark circles under their eyes, and a few of them are wearing headscarves. And it dawns on me what a lot of them are there for. And I start to get this panicky feeling, and I walk back through the waiting room, back down the hallway to the doctor, and she's still sitting there, and I kind of knock on the side of her door, and I say, I just have another question. What would the biopsy be ruling out exactly? And she says, well, the biopsy would be to rule out a rare form of breast cancer called inflammatory breast cancer. And I say, okay, and I start to walk down the hallway again. And at this point, I don't even make it to the waiting room before genuine panic starts to well up inside of me. And I turn around and I go back to the doctor's office and I just say, and at this point, there's almost, I feel teary. I'm having trouble controlling my emotions. And I just say, I just had one more question. Could I ask, please? How likely is it that this is inflammatory breast cancer and not mastitis, a breast infection? And I really just want her to stand up and get up from her computer at that point and just come to me and give me a hug and say, oh, honey, it's 1 in a million chance. We just have to rule it out for insurance purposes. You know how it is, malpractice and everything. Don't worry about it. And but she doesn't do that. She stays seated and she's very stoic and newscaster-like and says, I can't speak to that. Only the breast surgeon can speak to that. So you should just go get the biopsy. And I'm standing there and there are tears rolling down my cheeks at this point in time. And I think she can tell that I need something more from her. And so she adds this one last thing. She says, I can tell you that mastitis is extremely common and inflammatory breast cancer is extremely rare. And this becomes my mantra over the next afternoon, evening. I just say this over and over again to myself, to anyone who will listen. I say it to my husband, my mother, the cab driver. Mastitis is extremely common. Inflammatory breast cancer is extremely rare. Mastitis is extremely common. And that gets me through that afternoon and that evening until it's the middle of the night again and I'm feeding James and I just get him down to sleep. And it's my turn to try to get a little bit of sleep and I can't sleep because I just keep thinking, what if I'm the rare one? And I think this is stupid. I need to get some sleep. You know what? I just need to play out the worst case scenario so that I can relax. So I think, well, what worst case scenario? I have breast cancer. Breast cancer is highly treatable. You constantly hear about people beating breast cancer. And I think, you know what? I'm just going to break this rule about medical Googling and I'm going to Google inflammatory breast cancer. And I Google inflammatory breast cancer and this is what I read. Inflammatory breast cancer is a rare and aggressive form of breast cancer that starts with the reddening and swelling of the breast and spreads quickly, with symptoms worsening within days or even hours. The prognosis is not as good as it is for most other types of breast cancer, with a median survival rate of 21 months. And I just feel like I've been sucker punched in the gut. I just think 21 months, oh my God, James won't even be 2 years old. And I just start thinking about how before, while I was in this sort of hellish newborn phase, I was thinking that 3 months felt like an eternity. And now that I'm faced with the idea of not having an eternity, it feels like a nanosecond. And where before I was waiting to get through that hard period and wishing it was over, now I just want to hang on to every moment. And before I know it, I'm just sobbing, these heaving sobs. And I wake up my husband and he just is like, what? What's the matter? Is the baby okay? What happened? And I said, yes, the baby's okay, but I don't want to die. I don't want to die. I want to be James's mom. And he said, what are you talking about? And I said, inflammatory breast cancer is the worst kind. I just Googled it. He's like, what are you doing Googling? Mastitis is extremely common. Inflammatory breast cancer is extremely rare. And he just repeats that to me over and over again throughout the night. And we're up half the night. And it's the first time since the baby that we're up, not because the baby's crying, but because I'm crying like a baby. And in the morning, I'm just exhausted and drained and I'm numb as the breast surgeon inserts this long needle into my breast and extract what looks like a combination of milk and pus and blood. And she leaves the exam room for what feels like a long time. And when she comes back, she says, okay, we'll send that material to the lab and we're going to culture the bacteria and see if we can find an antibiotic that it will respond to. And I don't really understand what she's telling me. And I say, oh, well, so there is some sort of infection? And she said, yes, you have an infection. And I say, well, okay, but there's not cancer? She said, "Oh, no, you don't have cancer. It's just mastitis. Mastitis is extremely common, you know." And I said, "Yeah, I heard." And I am just elated at that point in time. And I call my husband, I call my mom, and I take a taxi home. In the taxi, I'm not noticing anything that's passing me by. I just want to get home to my husband and son. So that night we celebrated, we ordered pizza, and I think we each ate about a pint of ice cream, and we dressed James in these PJs that said "yay" all over them, and that kind of encapsulated how we were all feeling that night. Just like, yay, there's nothing to worry about. And the cancer scare sucked, but the post-cancer scare euphoria was amazing, and nothing bothered me. Things that previously were getting under my skin with Jeff, or things that felt like a chore with the baby, I now was just thrilled to do. And colors seemed brighter, smells were stronger, just my senses were heightened, and I was just loving life. And that lasted for a good day and a half. And then it dawned on me, I've always not had cancer. What am I so happy about? And which is weird. It sounds ungrateful for my health, but it was just kind of truthful. I kind of went back to my baseline of how I felt about things. But there was a shift that happened for me after all of this. That was a lasting shift, which was prior to going through the cancer scare experience. I was looking at our current phase of life with the newborn through the lens of everything that I was missing out on from our previous life. And kind of with this wistful feeling of, and just kind of mourning the loss of our freedom and the things we like to do, and really had no conception of how I would get any of that stuff back. It felt very out of reach. And then after going through this, my perspective really shifted from looking at what I was missing out on to looking at our new life as everything we had to look forward to as a family of 3, and just being so grateful that I got to be around to participate in all of that. And that was really when things started to get better.
That was It Gets Better from Michelle Walson. Michelle is a writer, director, and producer with a passion for story. If you've been to a live Risk show anytime between 2009, its founding year, and today, you will have seen Michelle's handiwork. She's founding producer of that show and is the person responsible for helping the live storytellers to whip their stories into shape. I met Michelle about 2.5 years ago when I took her level 2 storytelling class through the People's Improv Theater, which she co-taught with David Crabb. And since then I've been on the Risk Show a couple times, and more recently Michelle and I have worked together on a solo show that I just premiered at the Tanks Dark Fest this past week, and it's playing again on Sunday, August 2nd at 3 p.m. And Michelle turned out to be a great director. I had no idea how to go from being a storyteller who stands there to doing a semi-theatrical long-form storytelling piece. And so in addition to helping people shape their work and directing that work, Michelle also writes screenplays, and as I mentioned, she teaches. And she also helps... this is pretty interesting. She's working with Melanie Hamlet on a memoir. And Melanie Hamlet is one of the more entertaining storytellers I've seen at Risk. And she's writing a memoir about her life, her peripatetic life, living out of her truck. I'm not sure when that's coming out, but when it does, it's sure to be an entertaining and compelling and wholly original read. There's not much else to report. I've recorded some really wonderful stories in the past couple of months, and so I'm still working on producing those. I kind of wish I had enough free time to release more than one every 4 to 6 weeks, but I think that's going to be the schedule for the near future, so you'll have to wait. But in the meantime, this has been episode 6 of Modern Stories Mix. My God, we made it to half a baker's dozen, or half an actual dozen. Anyway, we're here. I will be back probably in late August or early September with the next episode, which I promise you will be another moving and amazing story. In the meantime, have a great rest of the summer and stay cool.